The thunder of hooves echoed across the dusty plains as Rose Remington rode hard toward the horizon, her golden hair whipping wildly behind her. They'd been on her trail for 3 days now, and with every passing mile, she felt the burden of their words weighing heavier on her shoulders. "A woman can't run a ranch in these parts," they'd sneered. "Not without a man." But Rose had something to prove to them, to herself, and to the memory of her father who'd left her the lazy R ranch despite the protests of everyone in Willow Creek. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was no place for the faint of heart. As her mare crested the ridge, Rose spotted a lone figure in the distance, silhouetted against the setting sun. A cowboy, tall in his saddle, hat pulled low against the glare. She slowed her pace, caution overtaking urgency as she approached. "You look like you're running from something, madam," the stranger called out, his voice deep and steady as a mountain stream. Rose straightened her back, hand instinctively moving to the pistol at her side. "Not running. Riding to Silver Creek for supplies." The cowboy chuckled, tipping his hat back to reveal features as rugged as the landscape around them, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened with stubble, and eyes the color of the big sky above them. "Most folks don't ride like the devils on their heels when they're just after supplies." "I'm not most folks," Rose replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "That much is clear." He extended a gloved hand. "Xavier Abernathy, most call me Zav." Rose hesitated before taking his hand. "Rose Remington." The Remington girl, his eyebrows shot up. The one who inherited old William's spread. She snatched her hand back. "The one they said would fail before winter's end." "Yes, that's me." Xavier's expression softened. "I've heard talk. Folks aren't known for their kindness when it comes to change." "They said I'd never make it," she admitted, the words escaping before she could catch them. "That I should sell to Henderson and marry some shopkeeper in town." Xavier studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the horizon. "Well, Miss Remington, I've learned that what they say often has little bearing on what is." His lips curved into a small smile. "Then watch me walk beside you, if you'll permit it. I'm heading to Silver Creek myself." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and strangely comforting. Rose found herself nodding, despite the warnings that rang in her head about trusting strangers. There was something in his eyes, honesty perhaps, or maybe just a shared understanding of what it meant to be doubted. "I suppose company wouldn't be unwelcome," she conceded, urging her mare forward. As they rode side by side, the setting sun cast long shadows across the desert floor. Rose stole glances at her companion, wondering what twist of fate had placed him in her path. Little did she know that this chance meeting would change the course of her life forever. The town of Silver Creek appeared as a cluster of wooden buildings and lantern light against the darkening sky. As they approached, Xavier pulled his horse closer to Rose's. "Word of advice," he said in a low voice. "Henderson's men frequent the saloon here. Might be best if you're not seen alone." Rose bristled. "I can handle myself, Mr. Abernathy." "No doubt about that," he replied with a hint of amusement. "But sometimes it's not about capability, but rather appearances. Henderson's looking for any reason to prove you can't manage that ranch." Though reluctant to admit it, Rose knew he was right. Thomas Henderson, owner of the largest cattle operation in the county, had been trying to buy her father's land since before he was laid to rest 3 months ago. "Fine," she conceded, "but don't mistake this for weakness." Xavier's laugh was warm like whiskey. "Miss Remington, I believe weakness is the last word anyone would associate with you." They hitched their horses outside the general store, which was thankfully still open despite the late hour. The proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, barely concealed his surprise at seeing Rose with a companion. "Miss Remington," he greeted, eyes darting between her and Xavier. "Didn't expect to see you this late and with company, Mr. Jenkins." Rose nodded. "I need supplies. Here's my list." While Jenkins gathered her order, muttering about improper hours for a lady to be out, Xavier browsed the shelves, occasionally adding items to the growing pile on the counter. "You planning to feed an army, Miss Remington?" Jenkins asked, tallying the goods. Just preparing for winter, she replied coolly. Winter's a ways off yet, Jenkins remarked. Most folks think you won't last till harvest, let alone the first snow. Rose's knuckles went white as she gripped the edge of the counter. Most folks would do well to mind their own affairs. Xavier stepped forward, placing a bag of coffee on the counter. I'll take this as well, he said, his tone pleasant but firm. And perhaps you could remind most folks that predictions have a way of proving false when determination is involved. Jenkins' face reddened as he added the coffee to the tally. Rose felt a surge of gratitude toward Xavier, though she kept her expression neutral. Outside, as they loaded the supplies onto their horses, Rose finally spoke. Thank you for that, though I didn't need defending. Xavier secured a sack of flour to his saddle. It wasn't defense so much as a different perspective. Sometimes people need reminding that the limits they imagine for others are just that imaginary. Before Rose could respond, the batwing doors of the saloon across the street burst open, spilling light and raucous laughter onto the dusty road. 3 men stumbled out, one pointing directly at Rose. Well, if it ain't the little lady rancher, he called, his words slurring. Henderson says you'll be begging him to buy that worthless plot by month's end. Rose's hand moved to her pistol, but Xavier stepped subtly between her and the men. Evening, gentlemen, he called, his voice friendly but with an edge that made the men pause. Beautiful night for minding one's business, isn't it? The lead man squinted, trying to focus. Who are you supposed to be, her hired gun? His companions laughed, though it sounded forced. Just a fellow appreciating the night air, Xavier replied, shifting his coat to reveal the pistol at his hip, and hoping we can all enjoy it peacefully. A tense moment passed before one of the other men tugged at his friend's sleeve. Come on, Lyle, let's get another drink. Lyle spat in the dirt, but allowed himself to be led back into the saloon, tossing one last glare over his shoulder. Rose let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I see Henderson's influence spreads far. Men like Henderson use fear and money to control territories, Xavier said, checking his horse's girth strap. But neither works on those who refuse to be bought or frightened. Rose studied him in the faint light from the store's windows. You speak as if you've dealt with his kind before. Let's just say I recognize the breed, Xavier mounted his horse. We should move on. There's a camping spot about 5 miles east near the creek, safe enough to rest before heading back to your ranch tomorrow. Rose hesitated. You've been there before. I've been most places in this territory, he replied cryptically. Comes with the job. And what job is that, Mr. Abernathy? Xavier smiled, moonlight catching in his eyes. Tonight, it seems to be riding companion to a stubborn ranch owner. Tomorrow, who can say? Despite her better judgment, Rose found herself following him out of town, questions swirling in her mind about this stranger who had appeared so suddenly on her path. They made camp by the creek, a small fire casting dancing shadows across their faces. After a simple meal of beans and jerky, Rose broke the companionable silence. You never said what brings you to these parts, Mr. Abernathy. Xavier leaned back against his saddle. No, I didn't. He stared into the flames for a long moment before continuing. I track things people sometimes. Lost cattle, lost fortunes, lost souls. A bounty hunter, Rose tensed. Of sorts, though not in the way you're thinking. I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. He pulled a small badge from his pocket, the silver glinting in the firelight. Rose's eyes widened. A detective in Silver Creek. Following a lead on cattle rustling across the territory, seems someone's been organizing a rather sophisticated operation. He tucked the badge away. Your father's name came up in my investigation before his passing. Pa, Rose sat up straighter, he would never be involved in rustling. Xavier raised a placating hand. Not as a suspect, as someone who might have information. He reported unusual activity on the borders of his land last spring. Nothing came of it officially, but it matches patterns I've been tracking. Rose's mind raced. Her father had mentioned strange tracks, cattle gone missing only to reappear days later. She'd attributed it to his aging mind, but now— "Henderson," she whispered. "It's Henderson, isn't it? That's why he's so desperate for our land. It borders his eastern pastures." Xavier's expression gave nothing away. "I can't make accusations without proof, but I'd be interested in seeing those borders myself." "I'll show you," Rose decided. "Tomorrow, if Henderson is using my father's land for illegal activities, I want him stopped." Xavier nodded slowly. "Just remember, Miss Remington, men like Henderson don't take kindly to interference. This could put you in more danger than you already face." "I've been in danger since the day I decided to keep my father's ranch," she replied firmly. "At least this gives me a chance to fight back." As the fire burned low, Rose watched Xavier across the dying embers. He was an enigma, a detective appearing just when she needed an ally, offering help without condition. Trust came hard in the territories, but something about Xavier Abernathy made her willing to try. Morning broke clear and crisp over the desert landscape. Rose woke to find Xavier already up, coffee brewing over a small fire. He handed her a tin cup without comment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Trouble?" she asked, sipping the strong brew. "Just habit," he replied. "Been followed too many times to let my guard down." They broke camp efficiently and were back on the trail as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. The journey to the Lazy R Ranch took them through stretches of scrubland and rocky outcroppings, the terrain growing more familiar to Rose with each passing mile. "There," she said, pointing to a distant structure as they crested a ridge. "Home." The ranch house wasn't grand, but it was solid 2 stories of weathered wood and stone, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. A wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, and Rose felt a surge of emotion at the sight. "Raymond must have kept the fire going," she explained. "Our foreman." "One of the few who stayed after Pa died." Xavier nodded. "Loyal men are worth their weight in gold out here." As they approached, a figure emerged from the barn, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He raised a hand in greeting, then froze when he spotted Xavier. "Quien ease." He called to Rose, hand moving to his belt. "A friend, Raymond," Rose called back. "Mr. Abernathy is helping me with our neighbor troubles." Raymond relaxed slightly but kept a wary eye on Xavier as they dismounted. "Señorita Rose, 3 of Henderson's men rode by yesterday." They were looking at the north boundary again. Rose exchanged a glance with Xavier. "That's where Pa reported the strange tracks. We should start there." After stabling their horses and refreshing their supplies, Rose led Xavier toward the northern boundary of the ranch. Raymond insisted on accompanying them, his rifle slung across his back. "How much land do you have here?" Xavier asked as they rode. 5,000 acres, Rose replied. "Not as much as Henderson's spread, but good land, water access, grazing fields, even some timber in the northern section." "Valuable," Xavier observed. "Too valuable to let go," Rose agreed. "Pa built this place from nothing. Came here when the territory was still wild, married my mother against her family's wishes. They said he'd never make it." She smiled sadly. "They were wrong then, just as they're wrong about me now." Xavier studied her profile. "Your father taught you well, it seems." "Everything I know," she confirmed. "After Mother died, it was just the 2 of us for 10 years. He taught me ranching, shooting, even how to drive a hard bargain at cattle auctions. The men didn't like it, but Pa said the future belonged to those brave enough to claim it." They reached a ridge overlooking a narrow canyon. Rose pointed to a barely visible trail winding through the rocks below. "That's not a cattle path," Raymond said, dismounting to examine the ground. "Too narrow, and the rocks have been cleared intentionally." Xavier knelt beside him, running his fingers along the dirt. "Recent traffic, more than 1 horse, probably within the last day or 2, Rose frowned. "This is miles from anywhere. There's no reason for anyone to pass through here unless they're avoiding the main roads and eyes that might see them," Xavier finished, standing. "Perfect route for moving stolen cattle or other goods without detection." They followed the trail down into the canyon, moving carefully to avoid dislodging rocks that might announce their presence. The passage narrowed until they were forced to proceed single file, the walls of stone rising high on either side. "Not much further now to the boundary with Henderson's land," Rose whispered. As the canyon widened again, they emerged into a small, hidden valley. What they saw made Rose gasp. A makeshift corral had been constructed, containing at least 30 head of cattle, some bearing Henderson's brand, others with marks she didn't recognize. "Holding pen," Xavier murmured. "They keep them here until they can alter the brands, then move them out along that trail." He pointed to another path leading east. "Señorita," Ramon hissed, pulling them behind a boulder. "Riders coming." They crouched low, watching as 3 men rode into the valley from the eastern trail. Rose recognized one immediately, Lyle, from outside the saloon. The others were Henderson's ranch hands too, though she didn't know their names. "Henderson said to move these tonight," Lyle was saying. "Buyers coming from Tucson wants them by sunrise." "What about the Remington girl?" one of the others asked. "She's been riding these boundaries lately." Lyle spat. "Henderson says she won't be a problem much longer. He's calling in her father's debts from Jenkins at the Mercantile. She'll be forced to sell before the month's out." Rose felt cold rage build inside her. "There were no debts," she whispered. "Pa owned that land free and clear." "Forged papers, most likely," Xavier replied softly. "Henderson's getting desperate." They watched as the men inspected the cattle, making plans for their movement later that night. When they finally rode off, Rose stood, her face set in determination. "We need to get the sheriff," she said. "The sheriff's in Henderson's pocket," Ramon reminded her. Xavier nodded. "He's right. We need more than just what we've seen. We need proof Henderson is behind this, not just his men acting alone." "Then we'll get it," Rose declared. "Tonight, when they move the cattle." Xavier studied her for a long moment. "This could be dangerous." "My whole life is dangerous right now," she replied. "At least this way, I'm fighting back instead of waiting for Henderson to take everything." As dusk settled over the ranch, Rose, Xavier, and Ramon prepared for the night ahead. They checked their weapons, packed supplies, and discussed strategy around the kitchen table. "I'll approach from the north ridge," Xavier explained, pointing to a rough map he'd sketched. "If I can get close enough when Henderson arrives, I can document the transaction." "Ramon, you'll be here at the mouth of the canyon to prevent anyone from escaping that way." "And me?" Rose asked, already knowing she wouldn't like his answer. Xavier's expression was apologetic but firm. "You should stay here at the ranch." "If something goes wrong, absolutely not," she interrupted. "This is my land, my fight. I'm coming." Xavier started to argue, but Ramon cleared his throat. "Señorita Rose shoots better than most men I know, and she knows every inch of this land." Xavier sighed, recognizing defeat. "Fine. But you stay with me, and if I say run, you run. No heroics." As night fell, they rode out, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main trails. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, providing enough light to navigate but not enough to expose them. They left their horses concealed in a grove of juniper trees half a mile from the hidden valley, continuing on foot. "Remember," Xavier whispered as they approached the ridge, "our goal is evidence, not confrontation. Once we have proof Henderson is involved, I can wire for federal marshals from Silver Creek." Rose nodded, her heart pounding as they took up positions overlooking the makeshift corral. Ramon had already disappeared toward the canyon entrance, silent as a shadow. They didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, the sound of approaching riders reached them. Lyle and 5 other men arrived first, followed shortly by a wagon from the eastern trail. Finally, a lone rider appeared from the South. Thomas Henderson himself, his white hair visible even in the dim light. "That's him," Rose whispered, gripping her rifle tighter. Xavier placed a calming hand on her arm. "Easy, let's hear what they say." From their vantage point, they could make out most of the conversation. Henderson was clearly in charge, directing the men to prepare the cattle for transport and negotiating with the buyer who had arrived in the wagon. $50 a head, Henderson was saying. Premium stock, clean brands by morning. The buyer, a thin man with a city accent, argued for a lower price. These aren't all your cattle, Henderson. I'm taking a risk buying stolen goods. Not stolen, Henderson replied smoothly. Merely redistributed from owners who can't properly manage their herds, like that Remington girl. Half these beasts were wandering loose on her property. Consider it a service. Rose bit back a curse. Xavier was scribbling notes in a small book, documenting everything they heard. The transaction was nearly complete when disaster struck. A loose rock shifted under Rose's boot, clattering down the ridge. The sound wasn't loud, but in the quiet night, it might as well have been a gunshot. What was that? Henderson's voice carried up to them. Probably just a coyote, someone answered, but Henderson wasn't convinced. Check it out, he ordered. Lyle, take 2 men and sweep the ridge. Xavier grabbed Rose's arm. Time to go, he whispered urgently. They began retreating, trying to move quickly while staying low and quiet. But the rocky terrain made stealth difficult, and soon they heard the sounds of pursuit. There, up on the ridge, Lyle's voice rang out, followed by the crack of a rifle shot. The bullet whined past Rose's head, sending rock fragments flying. Xavier pulled her behind an outcropping, drawing his pistol. Run for the horses, he ordered. I'll hold them off. I'm not leaving you, Rose insisted, bringing her own rifle up. This isn't a debate, Xavier's eyes flashed in the darkness. Get to Raymond, get back to the ranch, and wait for me. Before she could protest further, he fired 3 rapid shots toward their pursuers, forcing them to take cover. Then he gave her a gentle push. Go, please. The desperation in his voice convinced her. With a last glance at him, Rose darted away, using the rocks and scrub brush for cover as she made her way toward where Raymond should be stationed. Gunshots echoed behind her, punctuated by shouts and the occasional ricochet off stone. Rose's heart hammered in her chest, fear for Xavier threatening to overwhelm her. But she pushed on, knowing the best way to help him was to reach safety and bring back reinforcements. She was nearly to the canyon entrance when a figure loomed before her. Rose raised her rifle, finger tightening on the trigger before recognizing Raymond. What happened? He demanded, grabbing her arm to steady her. Ambush, she gasped. Xavier's holding them off. We need to help him. Raymond hesitated, torn between protecting Rose and aiding Xavier. The horses first, he decided. Then we circle back. They reached the junipers without incident and mounted quickly. Instead of heading for the ranch, however, Rose turned her mare back toward the gunfire. Señorita. Raymond protested. We can't leave him, she said simply, spurring her horse forward. They approached cautiously, hearing that the gunfire had become sporadic. As they neared the ridge, a lone figure staggered toward them. Rose's heart leapt to her throat until moonlight revealed Xavier's familiar silhouette. She dismounted in an instant, rushing to him. Are you hurt? Xavier shook his head, though he was breathing hard. Winged one of them. They retreated to regroup. He looked past her to Raymond. Henderson will have his men scouring every inch of this land by dawn. We need to move now. The ranch, Rose decided. We'll fortify it and send for help. They rode hard through the night, taking a circuitous route to avoid potential ambushes. By the time they reached the Lazy R, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Inside the ranch house, Xavier collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, finally revealing a bloody tear in his sleeve. You said you weren't hurt. Rose exclaimed, already gathering bandages and water. It's just a graze, he insisted, though his pale face suggested otherwise. While Rose cleaned and bandaged his arm, Xavier outlined their situation to Raymond. Henderson knows we've seen his operation. He can't afford to let that information get out. Can you still write to the marshals? Rose asked, tying off the bandage. Xavier nodded grimly. If I can get to Silver Creek, but Henderson's men will be watching the trails. And even if the wire gets through, it could be days before marshals arrive. We won't last days if Henderson decides to attack in force, Ramon said bluntly. Rose straightened, determination replacing fear. Then we don't wait, we take the fight to him. Both men stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Henderson has resources, men influence, Xavier argued. We're three people with limited ammunition and no reinforcements. We have something better, Rose countered. We have his secret. If Henderson's rustling operation became public knowledge, he'd lose everything: his standing, his contracts with the army, possibly his freedom. Xavier's expression shifted from disbelief to consideration. You're suggesting blackmail. I'm suggesting leverage, Rose corrected. Henderson doesn't know what evidence we have. He doesn't know if we've already contacted authorities. That uncertainty gives us power. Ramon nodded slowly. It could work. Henderson values his reputation above all else. It's risky, Xavier warned. If he calls our bluff, then we're no worse off than we are now, Rose finished. But I don't think he will. Men like Henderson don't gamble when their empire is at stake. As the sun rose fully, they finalized their plan. Ramon would deliver a message to Henderson requesting a meeting on neutral ground, the Silver Creek Church, at noon. The message would hint at evidence already secured and authorities already notified, but offer a chance to negotiate terms. He'll come armed, Xavier warned as Ramon prepared to leave, and he'll bring men. So will we, Rose replied, checking her father's shotgun, but if all goes well, no shots will be fired. After Ramon departed, Rose and Xavier fortified the ranch as best they could. They moved horses to the most distant pasture, secured valuables, and prepared escape routes should the worst happen. Through it all, a tension hung between them, unspoken questions about what would come after if they survived this confrontation. Finally, as they sat drinking coffee on the porch, Rose broke the silence. Why did you help me? That first day on the trail you could have ridden on left me to my fate. Xavier considered the question, watching hawks circle in the distant sky. I've spent most of my life hunting men who prey on the vulnerable, who use power to crush those with less. When I saw you defiant, determined, facing impossible odds, he smiled faintly. I suppose I recognized something worth fighting for. Rose studied his profile, seeing beyond the detective to the man beneath. And after, when this is over, assuming we survive, Xavier turned to her, his blue eyes serious. That depends on what you want, Miss Remington. My assignment here will end one way or another, but where I go next could be influenced by compelling reasons to stay. The implication hung in the air between them, filled with possibility. Rose was about to respond when hoofbeats in the distance announced Ramon's return. The moment passed, but the promise in Xavier's eyes remained. Ramon rode into the yard, his expression grim. Henderson agreed to the meeting, noon at the church as suggested, but he doesn't come alone, he brings his lawyer and 3 men, as expected, Xavier nodded. Did he seem worried? Like a man with a rattlesnake in his boot, Ramon confirmed with a slight smile. He is not certain what we know or who we've told. That uncertainty eats at him. Rose checked the old grandfather clock in the hallway. It's almost 10, we should prepare to ride. They armed themselves, carefully, weapons visible enough to show they weren't defenseless, but not so ostentatious as to suggest they were seeking violence. Xavier tucked his notebook and badge into his coat pocket, concrete proof of his authority. Before mounting up, he pulled Rose aside. Stay close to me in there. Henderson's a cornered animal now, and that makes him dangerous. Rose nodded, touched by his concern. Together, then, like you said that first day, watch me walk beside you. The ride to Silver Creek was tense, each of them scanning the landscape for signs of ambush. But they arrived without incident, finding the small white church standing quiet and solemn under the midday sun. Henderson's horses were already hitched outside, confirming he had arrived before them. Let me enter first, Xavier instructed as they dismounted. Ramon, watch the door. Rose, stay between us. The church interior was cool and dim after the bright sunlight. Henderson sat in the front pew, his massive frame incongruous in the humble surroundings. Beside him was a thin man in an Eastern suit, the lawyer, presumably, and 3 ranch hands stood along the wall, hands never far from their weapons. "Detective Abernathy," Henderson greeted, his voice falsely jovial. "And Miss Remington, how nice of you to join us for this discussion." Xavier kept a measured distance, positioning himself slightly in front of Rose. "Mr. Henderson, I believe you know why we're here." Henderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Some nonsense about cattle rustling, I'm told, completely unfounded, of course. My lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, is prepared to file defamation charges should such accusations be made public." Xavier pulled out his notebook. "Interesting approach, particularly given what we witnessed last night. 30 head of mixed-brand cattle, a buyer from Tucson, and you personally negotiating the sale of stolen livestock. I've documented times, locations, participants, and your exact words." Henderson's facade cracked slightly. "You have no proof, don't I?" Xavier countered. "The Pinkerton Agency has been investigating cattle theft across 3 territories for months. We have witness statements, transaction records, and now direct observation of your operation. My report was dispatched to both the agency headquarters and the federal marshal's office in Tucson this morning. It was a bluff, they'd had no chance to send any such reports, but Henderson couldn't know that." Rose watched as uncertainty flickered across the rancher's face. "Even if this absurd tale were true," Whitmore interjected smoothly, "you have no proof Mr. Henderson was aware of any wrongdoing. Perhaps some overzealous employees acted without his knowledge." "His employees?" Rose stepped forward, anger overriding caution. "I heard him give the orders myself. I heard him boast about stealing my cattle and forging documents to steal my land." Henderson's face reddened. "You're a desperate woman spinning tales to keep land you can't possibly manage. That land has been in my family for 20 years, Rose retorted. "And I'll see it burn before I let you steal it through lies and intimidation." The tension in the room crackled like lightning before a storm. One of Henderson's men shifted, his hand drifting toward his gun. Xavier subtly adjusted his position, ready to draw if necessary. "Perhaps," the lawyer said, breaking the standoff, "there is a compromise to be reached, a business arrangement that benefits all parties." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "We're listening." "Mr. Henderson withdraws any claims to Miss Remington's property. In exchange, your report never reaches its final destination." Whitmore adjusted his spectacles. "Additionally, Mr. Henderson could offer a generous compensation for any inconvenience caused." "He's trying to buy us off," Rose murmured to Xavier. "I know," he replied quietly. "But it gives us an opening." He addressed Henderson directly. "Those terms are insufficient. Here's our counter-offer. You abandon all claims to the Remington property. You cease all rustling operations immediately. You compensate not only Miss Remington, but all ranchers whose cattle you've stolen." Henderson started to protest, but Xavier continued. "In return, my report will focus on the operational aspects of the rustling without naming you specifically. You'll have the opportunity to distance yourself, blame subordinates, and salvage your reputation. Not ideal for justice, perhaps, but practical for all concerned." A heavy silence fell over the church. Henderson exchanged looks with his lawyer, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Draw up the terms," he instructed Whitmore. "I want this matter concluded by sundown." Relief washed over Rose, though she kept her expression neutral. They weren't out of danger yet, not until everything was signed and Henderson's men were far from her land. The negotiations continued for hours, each detail argued and clarified. By late afternoon, documents were prepared, compensation agreed upon, and boundaries re-established. Henderson signed with barely concealed rage, his pen nearly tearing through the paper. "This isn't over," he hissed to Rose as he stood to leave. "You've won a battle, not the war." Xavier stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Henderson, it is over. Because if anything at all happens to Miss Remington or her property, The complete, unredacted report of your activities will find its way to every law enforcement agency and newspaper in the territory. Am I clear?" Henderson's face contorted with fury, but he nodded stiffly before storming out, his entourage following like shadows. When they were alone, Rose collapsed onto a pew, the tension of the day finally catching up with her. "Did we just win?" Xavier sat beside her, equally exhausted. "For now. Henderson won't give up easily, but we've bought time and protection." "And the real rustling report, will you file it?" Xavier smiled wryly. "A modified version, enough to stop the operation and warn other ranchers, but without naming Henderson directly as promised. The Pinkerton agency values results over strict justice sometimes." Rose nodded, understanding the practicalities of survival in the territories. "And what about you? Your investigation is over." "Almost," he corrected. "I'll need to write my final report, tie up loose ends." He hesitated, then added softly, "But after that, I find myself reluctant to leave just yet." Their eyes met, and Rose felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or adrenaline. The Lazy R could use a detective's perspective, for security purposes, of course. "Of course," Xavier agreed, a smile tugging at his lips. "Strictly professional." But there was nothing professional about the way his hand covered hers on the worn wood of the pew, or the warmth that spread through her at his touch. Raymond cleared his throat from the doorway, reminding them they weren't entirely alone. "Señorita, we should return before dark." The ride back to the ranch was lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. They spoke of practical matters, rebuilding fences, hiring additional hands, planning for the coming winter, but beneath the conversation ran a current of possibility, of futures reimagined. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the Lazy R, Rose reined her horse to a stop, taking in the view of the place she had fought so hard to keep. The setting sun bathed the buildings in golden light, transforming the humble ranch into something magical. "It's beautiful," Xavier said, stopping beside her. "I can see why you couldn't let it go." "It's not just the land," Rose replied. "It's what it represents. Everything my father built, everything he believed in, that a person should be judged by their determination, not their circumstances. That with enough heart, anything is possible." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "They said you'd never make it," he recalled her words from their first meeting. Rose smiled, reaching over to take his hand. "And you said you'd walk beside me." "I meant it," he said simply. "If you'll have me." In that moment, with the land spread before them and the future wide open, Rose knew with absolute certainty that her father had left her more than just a ranch. He had given her the courage to fight for what mattered, to trust her instincts, and to recognize a kindred spirit when fate placed him in her path. "I think I will," she answered, squeezing his hand. "After all, we make a rather effective team." In the weeks that followed, the Lazy R transformed. With Henderson's compensation money, Rose hired new ranch hands, repaired buildings, and purchased additional cattle. Xavier stayed on, ostensibly to monitor Henderson's compliance with their agreement, though everyone knew his reasons ran deeper. Word spread quickly through the territory how Rose Remington had stood up to Thomas Henderson, and how she had partnered with a Pinkerton detective to expose corruption, how the Lazy R was flourishing under her guidance. The same voices that had predicted her failure now spoke with reluctant admiration of her success. On a crisp autumn evening, Xavier found Rose on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. He sat beside her on the swing, their shoulders touching comfortably. "Letter from the agency today," he said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "They've officially closed the rustling case. Henderson's buyer in Tucson was arrested last week, which should effectively end the operation." Rose nodded, relieved but not surprised. "And your next assignment?" Xavier was quiet for a moment. "I've requested a permanent posting to this region, supervising investigations rather than conducting them directly." He turned to face her. "It would mean staying in one place, putting down roots." The implication hung in the air between them, filled with promise. Rose's heart quickened. The Lazy R could use a permanent security consultant, she offered, her voice light despite the weight of the moment. The position comes with room and board. Xavier laughed softly. Is that all it comes with? Rose met his gaze steadily. That depends on the consultant. And how brave he's feeling. In answer, Xavier leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Rose responded, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. When they finally parted, they were both breathless. I think, Xavier murmured, his forehead resting against hers, this consultant might be willing to negotiate additional terms. Rose smiled, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. I've been told I drive a hard bargain. I'm counting on it, he replied, pulling her close again. As darkness fell over the Lazy R, Rose reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here from a grieving daughter fighting to save her father's legacy, to a woman who had found not just survival but triumph. They had said she would fail, that a woman couldn't manage a ranch alone in these harsh territories. They had been wrong, and as for being alone. Rose glanced at Xavier, his profile illuminated by the last light of day, and knew she had found something her father would have valued above all else, a partner who saw her strength rather than her limitations, who walked beside her rather than ahead or behind. What are you thinking? Xavier asked, noticing her contemplative gaze. Rose smiled, leaning into his embrace. That sometimes the greatest victories come when we refuse to believe in other people's limitations for us. Xavier nodded, understanding perfectly. Your father would be proud. Yes, she agreed softly. I think he would. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Xavier officially left the Pinkerton agency to become a full partner in the Lazy R, bringing his investigative skills to bear on improving ranch operations. Rose continued to expand their holdings, eventually purchasing a struggling neighboring property that Henderson had been forced to sell after his other ventures collapsed. Their wedding, held the following spring, brought people from across the territory, some curious to see the woman who had defied expectations, others genuinely happy for the couple who had found each other against all odds. Remington served as Xavier's best man, his weathered face beaming with pride. As they stood beneath an archway of wildflowers, exchanging vows before the community, Rose thought of all the voices that had tried to limit her, to define what she could and couldn't accomplish. How hollow those predictions seemed now, in the face of what she and Xavier had built together. They said I'd never make it, she whispered to him as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. Xavier smiled, holding her close. And I said I'd walk beside you. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. It seems we were both right. By the time their first child was born, a daughter with Rose's determination, and Xavier's thoughtful eyes, the Lazy R had become one of the most successful operations in the territory. Rose managed the business while Xavier handled security and special projects, their partnership as strong in work as it was in love. They named their daughter Willow, after the creek where they had first met. As she grew, she showed the same stubborn independence that had defined her mother, along with her father's keen observational skills. By the time she was 10, she could ride as well as any ranch hand and had a knack for finding lost calves that amazed even the most experienced cowboys. She's going to take over the Lazy R someday, Rose remarked one evening, watching Willow help Remington with the evening chores. And expand it into an empire, most likely, Xavier agreed with a chuckle. God help anyone who tells her she can't. Life in the territories remained challenging: droughts, harsh winters, occasional disputes with neighboring ranches, but the foundation they had built proved strong enough to weather any storm. The legend of Rose Remington and her Pinkerton detective grew with each passing year, inspiring other women to challenge the limitations society placed upon them. On the 20th anniversary of their first meeting, Xavier took Rose back to the ridge where they had first encountered each other. A small cabin stood there now, a retreat they had built for quiet moments away from the bustling ranch. As they watched the sunset paint the landscape in gold and crimson, Xavier wrapped his arms around his wife from behind. "Any regrets?" he asked, his voice soft in her ear. Rose leaned back against him, content in a way she once would have thought impossible. Not a single one, even though the path wasn't easy. She turned in his arms to face him, taking in the silver now threading through his dark hair, the laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of 20 years of shared joy. "The worthwhile paths rarely are," she replied, "but having the right companion makes all the difference." As twilight deepened into night, they stood together on the ridge, two people who had refused to accept the limitations others would have imposed upon them. They had built something extraordinary, not just a successful ranch, but a life defined by courage, partnership, and love. And far below, the lights of the lazy R glowed warm against the gathering darkness, a beacon of possibility in a land where determination still mattered more than convention, and where the future belonged to those brave enough to claim it.